Yeah, thanks very much. It's great to be here, which raises the question of what it means to be here. And I was saying before we started that I actually spoke at this conference 4 years ago. And given the topic of my talk, it's really interesting to have that contrast and how different it feels to be doing this from home via Zoom, as opposed to making a long but enjoyable journey up to Glasgow from where I live in the southeast. And I come to this topic as someone who has been fascinated by social media platforms in higher education for a very long time now. And when I began, they were something which was at best, and at best they were perceived as being irrelevant to scholarship or serious work, and at worst they were seen as being actively suspicious, as something that could be actively corrosive of the real work that we were imagined to be doing within the academy. And in the time since then, we've witnessed a quite significant transformation. It was something that was hinted at in a favorite article of mine in 2010, where Jesse Daniels and Joe Fagan talked about the coming social media revolution in the academy. And in the time since that article, my work has tried to understand the landscape of social media within higher education, but also to support the development of professional cultures which can help us realize some of the scholarly potential of these platforms. And if not overcome or completely avoid the downsides, at least find ways to counteract them to varying degrees. And I came to this expecting that the social media revolution would happen, but along with many others, I thought this would be a slow process of cultural change. As more and more individual academics came to use these platforms in a normal way, they became more familiar. Universities started to recognize their use. They started to become institutionalized as taken for granted parts of academic work that could be, people would be trained for, they'd be evaluated, they'd be recognized in all manner of different ways. And while that was happening, in the last 18 months, we've seen something much more like a big bang, where rather than a slow process of cultural change, we've seen an enforced reliance on platforms. And this is the lens through which I've looked at things like research projects, conferences, seminars, editorial boards, networks over the last period of time. Because under these conditions, we're effectively doing digital scholarship by default. And my idea for today's talk is to try and put that state of affairs in context and to think practically about how we can respond to it, but also politically about the inequalities that have opened up under these conditions and how we can combine political and practical responses. And in this work, I've been, well, not just intellectually, I've been personally preoccupied, like so many of us, by the question of whether we'll see a return to pre-pandemic normal life. The sociologist Nicholas Christakis draws a useful distinction between what he terms the intermediate pandemic and the post-pandemic. In the former, we're recovering effectively from the variety of shocks these experiences and this crisis have generated, and the adjustments we've had to make to those shocks. Whereas in the latter, we come to something much more like normality, but it will be a changed world within which there is a new normal, both because of the adjustments that we've made and the implications of them over 2, 3, 4 years, but also because the pandemic has acted as an accelerant to existing social and technical changes that are underway. And so in this sense, I don't think we can assume that anything will snap back to the old normal. And in my work with the Post-Pandemic University Project, I've tried to understand what will the intermediate pandemic, which I think we're beginning to enter into now, and what will the post-pandemic look like within the university system? And much as in wider society, digitalization had been increasing for years within the university system. With colleagues at the Faculty of Education at Cambridge and Lancaster University, we've written about and organized events about what we term the platform university. So a university where digital platforms are not just specific tools used in particular areas, but become pervasive. They become things the institution relies upon to function. And in this sense, I think the pandemic university has been a platform university. And this was pretty much inevitable. And the question is, what will happen to that platformization after the pandemic has begun to pass and we enter the intermediate pandemic period? In the writing I'm doing at the moment on this, I talk about this as an equivalence between digital and face-to-face. And I mean this both as a normative claim, because actually on balance, I think this is probably quite a good thing, but also as a description of where I think policy and practice is heading, towards an assumption, towards the absence of an assumption that one is, so to speak, more natural than the other, whatever natural is taken to mean, and an increasing recognition that each constrains and enables in different ways. This is a point that science and technology studies scholars have been making for years. The kind of physical affordances of somewhere like a university campus, they constrain and enable in ways that tend to fall into the background. And actually, I think the contrast in our experience during the pandemic, the switch from an assumption of face-to-face as being the norm to one in which face-to-face is the exception, is something that's going to heighten our awareness and sensitivity to the contrasting affordances of digital and face-to-face. And I mean this very concretely. So, for example, when we are in physical rooms for academic purposes, I suspect we're all going to be more pervasively aware of the kinds of ways in which the layout of chairs, the position of a screen, the number of people who can sit comfortably in a room, how these make certain things easier than others, how they make certain things more difficult, how certain ways of being together are entirely precluded in the process. And I think it's important to think in these terms, not least of all because there's a risk that we engage in what in the edtech literature is sometimes talked about as campus envy. And we need to remember that the campus is often a difficult place to be. It's unwelcoming for many people in ways which those who, for numerous reasons, might instinctively feel at home in the university would fail to grasp. And in this sense, I think we've seen a kind of decentering rather than an obliteration of the campus. The campus has been problematized, and how we move forward through and beyond that problematization will be one of the driving forces shaping what academic practice comes to look like over the next year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And this raises lots of political and economic questions. The organizational theorist Martin Parker likens COVID-19 to an acid eating away the flesh. And he says that this has allowed us to see the bones of the social structure, the inequalities that were already there are now on the fore, newly visible. And he means this in the split between people who have wholly or entirely worked from home during the pandemic and those for whom it has been necessary to go out to work. And this is an important split, but one which we should remember, even at the height of the pandemic, only 46.6% of UK adults actually work from home. And at least my experience and many others has been that within our social networks, this has been a much more normalized experience. And I think this is part of Parker's point, the kinds of imaginaries we have about what normal working life is like and for whom, and what that reveals about the networks we're embedded within and the privileges we have or don't have within them. But I do think this is an important contrast, but the risk is that if we stick solely with this dichotomy, it opens up certain forms of inequality and make them visible, but it also closes down others, particularly the precise way in which someone has been relatively insulated from risk, the different things it can mean to work from home during the pandemic. The Salford academic Charles Knight has usefully written about this as the academic digital divide, which is something I've got preoccupied by during this time. Initially, simply because I went from having quite a comfortable office, albeit one that was shared, to working from home at a kitchen table in a chair that gave me constant back pain, in a perpetual process of negotiation with my partner about who would use video calls at which point in time, straining our Wi-Fi, when we would each give each other moments of uninterrupted space for certain kinds of activity. And this is from a relatively privileged position. But I think to understand this landscape of home working within the academy is in a similar way to the point Martin Parker made, something which opens out and allows us to see inequalities that were already there, but see them much more starkly in the process. And so I've written this as a series of questions, and I won't go through them all. And the reason I've done that is firstly because I'm still at a very early stage trying to think this through theoretically myself, but also because there are so many factors shaping this digital divide. Things like caring responsibilities, access to a private workspace, reliable internet connections, up-to-date equipment, and the time, money, and energy to invest in that equipment. But also, who lives in an area that is relatively quiet. I'm not sure if this is an unusual experience, but I found when working from home in the last 16 months, 17 months, the soundscape of where I live is very different during the day to how I imagined it to be. And this is possibly irritability from being confined at home when I don't particularly want to be. But it has been interesting to think about where those interruptions are coming from and the organization of our daily life and how that has changed. But there's also the question of who feels professionally or financially secure during a time of crisis. I'm in a relatively privileged situation in a number of ways, but the fact I was on a fixed term contract when the pandemic hit was a huge source of anxiety, and something which had to some extent faded into the background for me became an object of preoccupation. And there's an interesting cognitive psychology literature about the kinds of cognitive burdens that come from insecurity, how we cope with scarcity or struggle to cope with it, the costs it has on our capacity to attend and intend when we have to worry about basic aspects of our future. And I think it's very interesting to think about the full range of academic experiences during the pandemic in these terms. The experience of someone who doesn't have caring responsibilities, has a comfortable home office with reliable internet access and up-to-date technology, and isn't worried about their future, versus someone for whom there's an enormous anxiety about future employment. There are conditions that make working life very difficult, and there's not really any immediate prospect of these things easing. And I think we need a theory of the academic digital divide that can take account of this, both socioeconomically, organizationally, but also effectively as well, and to understand the politics of the affects that arise in this situation. But this has all been about people working from home, and I don't want to suggest that everyone's been working from home during the pandemic. If we think particularly about teaching, it's useful to incorporate into this model who is expected to teach, but also who is expected to teach under what conditions. So, for example, it's much easier for a professor to be able to exercise an influence over conditions they encounter. This might vary depending on who they are and what institution, but any professor, I think, is liable to find it easier to resist being asked to teach, for example, in a room that is poorly ventilated, than a graduate teaching assistant who is reliant on this work to pay for their fees. And these fault lines were already there, but this decentering of the university campus has, I think, exposed and entrenched them. And so I wanted to set things in that context because in the second half of the talk, I wanted to point to some of the practical questions that have opened up. But the risk of talking about practice is that it can be dichotomized and seen as apart from politics. And in my work, I've been very keen to try and understand the politics of social media in higher education, their implications for the organization of academic labor, who has to do more work, whose work becomes more enjoyable, how workloads are distributed across hierarchical teams. And similarly, I'd like to try and understand how we can respond practically as individuals, as networks, as groups to the challenges of the pandemic, but without losing sight of the political challenges and without giving up in the face of them, while retaining a desire to find particularly collective solutions to these issues. Well, at the heart of how I've approached this is the question of technology. And technology is very interesting for how it's seen within the social sciences. And there's a very different story here for the natural sciences for relatively obvious reasons. But particularly within the parts of the social sciences that I'm most familiar with, there's a tendency to see technology as a contingent or peripheral part of scholarship. So, for example, something like the voice recorder, it's integral to qualitative research. And yet, for lack of a better way of putting it, we don't really have a nerd culture. We don't really have a techno culture around things like voice recorders in the way that one might expect, given how central they are as tools of the trade. So while conversations about the different options we have, their technological capacities do happen, they often happen in closed networks, or they often happen in specialized publications, in specialized journals, as opposed to being part of everyday conversation about what C. Wright Mills called the craft of scholarship. And there are lots of reasons for this, and this is quite a long and meandering story to kind of explicate properly. But the point I wanted to make is to think about how the university campus leaves us having a certain relationship to technology. The way in which infrastructure is provided by the university on the campus, and these conditions for teaching and research, they tend to fade into the background. So not always, particularly when things don't work, it's newly revealed to us as something we need to do our work, but which we don't have the capacity to control or sustain ourselves. But for most academics, most of the time, the infrastructure is a precondition. It's not an active consideration in everyday working life. But during the pandemic, when we have been to varying degrees working at a distance from campus, this taken for granted provision, I would argue, began to break down. And it began to break down at the same time as we saw a huge increase in the technological mediation of academic work. Jamie Woodcock very usefully observed a few years ago that for precarious staff, the university was always a bit more like a platform, something you accessed at a distance through online services, occasionally entering onto campus. And what I want to suggest is that this precarious mode of relating to the campus is something that has begun to spread, and it's opening up new fault lines and entrenching existing ones, which we can understand, I think, as this academic digital divide. And practically speaking, this means that technology becomes increasingly central, particularly technological decision-making, what in my work I've written about as technological reflexivity. Our capacity to not just use technology as a tool we can pick up and put down, but to purposefully shape our relationship to technology and sustain certain modes of use over time in ways that reflect our preferences, that reflect our dispositions, that reflect how we like to work. And this happens across a whole range of spheres. So things like connectivity, sound quality, video quality, the kinds of conditions we need for focus, and the comfort we have in addressing these issues. And as I've said, this is a practical challenge, and I think it's a really interesting practical challenge, because we now see something somewhat like a kind of technological cultural capital, where the capacity to be heard, the capacity to command attention, the capacity to win visibility and respect is now mediated through technological affordances to a much higher degree. And we have an intersection between the technology someone has available to them for these purposes, but also the approach they take to it, how much confidence and energy they can bring to it, and how agentive they feel in relation to it. But this exists alongside the political problematic of the stratification intensifying the inequality within the university. And so this sounds much more theoretically meandering than I intended it to, but I did mean this as a practical point, that how we start to think about the technology we use is something that is now, I would argue, integral to scholarship. In that sense, what in the literature is called digital scholarship is now something that is a feature of all scholarship. And we need to begin to develop that reflexive sensitivity to the technologies we're using, the influence we have over them, and how we exercise that influence over time in conditions that we often don't choose. But a more practical parallel point to that is how we engage digitally through that technology. At risk of stating the obvious, meetings, presentations, and teaching, they feel so much different when they're digitally mediated. And there are all sorts of well-rehearsed reasons for this: the confrontation with your own image, the fact our connections are unreliable, both the fear of them giving out, but also the stuttering and stalling that can derail the kind of natural flow of conversations, the lack of embodied feedback and the sense of being scrutinized or exposed. These will play out in different ways for different people, but there are some fundamental characteristics of what it is to coordinate and communicate through the affordances of a platform like Zoom that have different sorts of psychological and effective consequences for how these interactions feel to us. And there are some very practical things that we can do about this. Finding techniques which help us relax. I feel much more comfortable with a virtual background than I do with the kind of tiny room that is my study exposed. You can also remove your own image, something which I often do, but didn't occur to me to do for this session. And I just realized I do find it distracting that I can see myself. We can also connect via voice, and to do so in a way that is non-apologetic. I think it's a lovely practice for facilitators to make clear that people should be comfortable doing this, because there are some situations where it's just not bearable to have another video call in a day. And I've often thought in the last year that the mental health of academics could be improved so much if we made video calling the exception rather than the norm. Another feature that I think can be quite useful is we can strategically place notes when we're working remotely in a way that would be more difficult, at least if we're trying to make those notes non-obvious, than face-to-face. And these are techniques, and there's a sprawling grey literature about them. But the point is to not only realize these techniques are out there, but to experiment with them, to try different ways of engaging and to find which ones work for you and to try and understand why they work for you and to see if that gives you ideas about other techniques you could adopt. Because these are things that we've learned to do, or we were in the process of learning to do for face-to-face meetings and face-to-face interactions. And in that sense, there's an element of relearning involved in working through these media. In part, this can also be about presentation style. I personally found it very difficult to deal with the lack of embodied feedback in online presentations, the fact you don't have a feel for the room. And my approach to that has been to try and focus more on my own voice, which has a risk of becoming quite monological, but let me get a sense from how I could hear myself, whether I was talking and engaging in a way that felt like it was working for me or not. Looking at radio, listening to radio presenters can be useful for this, to try and find ways of engaging through voice that feel right to you. And if you can articulate what it is you like about them and all the aspects of their presentation that you can adopt yourself. Leaving space can be very difficult through Zoom. There's something, at least personally, I found about digital tumbleweeds that are so much more unsettling than if you leave space for people to fill in everyday face-to-face encounters. Giving feedback is also important. So by modeling the kinds of behavior that we enjoy and find valuable in online spaces, we can encourage others to do the same. I'm a big fan of the thumbs up and clapping icons on Zoom. These are really simple gestures, but if you are talking to a room full of blank screens, to occasionally see thumbs up and claps is really helpful to get a sense of feedback. And you can encourage others to do this at the same time. And also the chat on Zoom is not the perfect interface, to say the least, but it's something which is, potentially very powerful. And I think it's analogous to live tweeting in a very interesting and useful way. And so personally, I often find that I enjoy webinars most if I'm connected purely through voice, but I will often increasingly use the Zoom chat in a way similar to how I used to use live chat, how I used to do live tweeting. And the more we think about the kinds of interfaces available to us and the different ways we can use them, and the more we talk about this, it becomes easier to develop structures and norms and expectations that mediate and scaffold our use of these technologies. But that does require learning the technology itself, and this can be difficult simply because they are still relatively new. But also the nature of a platform like Zoom or Teams means that they're constantly rolling out new functionality. Sometimes buttons literally move around, from week to week. And to become familiar with that can make the process of using these systems so much easier and more successful. But this is quite simple things like learning the default settings, so you connect in the way that you prefer to be connected by default. Finding out how to use live captioning, looking for breakout rooms and ensuring you know how to use them. Particularly if we think about security, understanding access controls to determine who can and cannot get into the meeting. And also being familiar with how you can moderate the room and remove people if necessary. And across all of these things, there's just a role for establishing expectations. The choreography, for lack of a better term, for digital interaction, I think is often much more demanding than for face-to-face interaction, in part because we come to digitally mediated interaction from a much greater variety of settings, with a much more diverse range of experiences, and with less clarity about the kind of standardized expectations about what we should do when we meet together. And these skills are going to be part of academic life for the foreseeable future, and I think they can be developed as a reflexive process, and it's very useful to do that. And finally, one that's very close to my heart is the question of community. And I'll just talk about this very briefly because I've talked a bit longer than I intended to. But the constraint and the distancing of the pandemic, I think, really underscored the necessity of finding an academic community, an intellectual community, and sustaining your relationship with it in a way that works for you. And there are lots of forms this community can take and lots of ways in which you can build and sustain contacts with them. One feature of the pandemic that I think has been, for me, interesting, but subtly troubling for others, is the kinds of digital hoarding that can emerge under these conditions. Because there's so many things we can read, we encounter so much more material when everything is operating through digital platforms. And there's also been the explosion of webinars, which I think is wonderful, but can be completely overwhelming. I became aware very early on that I could spend my every working week nearly full-time in webinars that I was interested in if I wanted to. And this makes it difficult because we have to think about how we deal with this situation of abundance, how we create criteria for what we will engage with and what we won't engage with, and how we'll manage and store and respond to the different opportunities available to us. But just finally, I think the most exciting thing is that the costs of event organization have dropped to near zero in terms of things like room hire, catering, and travel. And this, I think, is very positive because when we're not having that kind of expenditure, there's less pressure to ensure that our events attract a big audience. There's more room to have niche events with experimental formats, to try out new ideas and to explore new ways of working together. And anecdotally, impressionistically, this, I think, has exploded during the pandemic. And I think this is a very positive thing. And at the heart of my work on social media has been a belief that we can develop a more participatory academic culture. There are limits to this. It won't overturn the hierarchies and inequalities of the academy, but it can be something really valuable. And my experience has been the pandemic has brought home the fact those possibilities are there now. And I think the more we realize them, the more of a bulwark we can create against the more pervasive and pernicious aspects of academic life. Well, I hope this has been useful, and I'd love to hear from you about your experiences, and also if you have any questions or would like me to talk a bit more about some of the things I've mentioned.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. That was incredibly stimulating and really practical advice as well. So we really appreciate everything you've said. I'm sure there are lots of questions or comments or outlines of people's own experiences as well. So if you do want to post anything in the chat, obviously you're very welcome to do that. Or if you want to just raise a hand, we can come to you, and you are very welcome to ask Mark a question directly.
Hi, Mark. I really enjoyed that talk. Thanks very much. I was particularly interested in some of the stuff you said about the kind of conditions of the pandemic and, oh, everything's moving, and how it kind of brought into sharper focus these kind of different conditions people were labouring under. In particular, that made me reflect on my own experience as a postgraduate researcher with young children at home during the pandemic and the kind of stress and difficulties of that. And I think since the kids have gone back to school and things have shifted a bit, yeah, becoming aware of actually how much my kind of higher level thinking was impeded by this sort of sense of precarity and time running out and not knowing what extensions were going to be available. So yeah, I just thought it was really interesting. You sort of hinted at this kind of whole effective landscape for underlying some of your thinking about that. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that because it sounded fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still in the early stages of writing about this systematically, but in my past work, I wrote about what I call cognitive triage. And it was a kind of philosophical approach to thinking about what we do when we rush and the effect rushing has on how we think about our future. And the difficulty that can arise in that situation because the day-to-day demands we're subject to are just so intensive that we can't look beyond the current day. You know, our horizon starts to be reduced into getting through each day, you know, crossing things off a to-do list when that to-do list gets longer and longer. And so what I'm keen to do is to take that concept of cognitive triage and to think much more concretely about the kinds of situations people faced during the pandemic within higher education, and to think about the kinds of demands people were subject to and the different ways in which they tried to negotiate them. My concern is that I don't want to kind of collapse everything into, you know, one concept. And so how to make that ethnographically rich is a question that I'm thinking about at the moment. But I do think it is an effective landscape, and it's one that we talk about interpersonally and when sharing experiences, but we don't have a systematic way of introducing it into professional conversations, and particularly policy conversations. And I think that's very important so that particularly university managers and leaders in the sector can think about how different the experiences during this time have been. And once we can label them, it becomes easier to respond to them. There's obviously lots of other challenges in the process. So I'm hoping writing about this could be a small contribution to kind of pushing along more of a political agenda about these issues.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I definitely feel like some of the policy around postgrads has kind of neglected to attend to the differences in the type of analytical thought that's required to do different sorts of research projects. And that, yeah, I mean, I've been doing kind of trying to do collaborative ethnography, and actually, you know, it wasn't the kind of thing that I could set up a to-do list and tick things off. I needed to be really immersed in it. And I think the policy around extensions has completely overlooked the kind of complexities of the mental and differences, the level of differences and differentiation in what type of thought was needed and how difficult that might be dependent on your material circumstances. Anyway, it sounds like your work will really contribute to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with how you're putting that. And one of the exciting things, though, is how Twitter in particular was helpful in organizing postgraduate campaigns about these issues. And so I'm really excited about how we can link the kinds of ways of sharing that we find through social media into organizing and campaigning through social media.
We have 10 minutes left, so we have more than enough time for some more questions to Mark. So again, you can post a chat, or if you want to raise your hand as Cassie did.
These are the digital tumbleweeds I was talking about.
I was going to wait for you to say that, but I'll jump in if I can. Thanks so much, Mark. It's great to hear your thinking on this area. And thanks also to Cassie for contributing that really important point about the differences with PGR experience as well. And I know that'll kind of sound very much with our communities here. I wanted to ask you to say a bit more, because I think what you provided for us, Mark, was in some ways, you know, it was kind of excellent self-help for all of us, digital self-help, but really kind of theorized and contextualized. And I suppose how I wanted to ask you about that, you were talking in that final slide about, you know, finding your community. And then I think in your previous slide, or one of the previous slides, you talked about finding your own style. And there's obviously, you know, within those very politicized fault lines that you talked about as well, in terms of setting up those bigger contexts, there's the question of the individual, the collective, or the community, and whatever, you know, kind of political affiliation you want to have in that. And then the institutional and some of the aspects of the institutional that some of us might feel more ill at ease with, or might make us, you know, kind of unhappier. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how you're negotiating in your own, I suppose in your own life, but then in your thinking as well, some of these aspects.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I find the second bit of that question easier than the first to answer. So in my work, I'm framing this in terms of a return to the debate about structure and agency, but trying to think more systematically about how different people are differently placed in relation to digital platforms, and the ways in which platforms both exercise an influence over how we use them and exercise an influence over how we are and how we look at the world through them and beyond them, but also how we can build cultures within platforms. So there's a tendency towards determinism about platforms, which I think is quite common theoretically, where we see Zoom, for example, or more frequently something like Facebook or Twitter, as necessitating certain ways of using it, as molding users' behavior in particular pernicious ways. And there's an element of truth to that, but I think we also have agency in relation to platforms. And so I'm interested in this notion of platform and agency, to find these spaces where we can work together to build norms and expectations and habits of use around platforms that can ensure certain characteristics are realized and start to negate or push back against some of the more negative ones. In terms of my own life, that's very tricky, really. I mean, I'm still a postdoc. I'm still on a fixed-term contract, and you know, I'm currently applying for jobs and torn between different disciplines because I came from sociology, but I now work in education, and trying to think through these issues in that context is quite tricky, really. And so my interest in reflexivity is somewhat self-interrogative in that sense. So I'm often reflecting on my own experiences of decision-making about technology and careers and everyday life and the relationship between them. And in many ways, there is a self-help aspect to it because I'm trying to think about how I manage those decisions myself, but also to try and theorize them in a way that is adequate to the mundane decision-making processes of others. And if it helps for context, my PhD was about the sociology of internal conversation. So I'm very interested in the kind of mundane ways in which we talk to ourselves and to people we're close to about practical matters and practical questions. And to try and recover this as a kind of sociologically salient factor, because it's often seen as narrowly psychological. Whereas I think it's fascinating to see organizations, sectors of society through this lens. And I think it's quite a productive way of getting to grips with some of the mundane aspects of how we work with tech in particular contexts.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was great.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Claire, for your question. Any other questions from folk in the room or in the virtual room? Just whilst we wait for people to formulate a question, I'm gonna come in with one if that's okay. Mark, I was curious, just when you talked about techniques, in terms of a variety of techniques, you talked about the practical tips of techniques to relax, for example, and with some of the later slides, then you talked about some of the kind of very practical dimensions of how we might think about using this type of technology that we're using today. I wondered if there's a way in which those types of new techniques that we're learning could be then retranslated into sort of in-person teaching back on campus, for example. So I'm just wondering about that sort of hybrid approach that everyone's having to think about at the moment. So yeah, just how those techniques can be perhaps translated into in-person forms of delivery in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fascinating question. And, the way in which we talk about hybrid teaching at the moment often feels like a placeholder. We don't really know what hybridity will look like and feel like in practice. And so I think to have conversations about how we find that return to face-to-face teaching will be really important, and to compare experiences. And what concerns me is that in most institutions, we don't really have a natural space to have those conversations. In my work at the Faculty of Education over the last year, I organized a series of drop-in sessions with the idea being that we had a particular theme for each week, and 3 colleagues were invited to talk briefly about their experience of that theme. But then it opened out into a wider conversation as people shared experiences in relation to that theme to kind of convey how they found it, what they've struggled with, what has helped them. And it's left me very interested in how we can build those deliberative forums as we go back to a more face-to-face model, how we find time for them, how we ensure that they are spaces that people feel happy and willing to share in, and also how we can allow issues to surface in them that are useful for policy and practice. Because I think there aren't really those feedback mechanisms, or aren't enough of them within higher education. And this was less of a problem when so much of it was routine. But the novelty of the last 16 months is not going to end, because as you're pointing to, going back to face-to-face and to find hybrid modes of teaching as well, this will be just as novel and in some ways possibly more challenging. And we urgently need to think about how we develop structures to support each other in that process and to learn collectively from the different experiences that we're having, which is a long-winded way of saying I don't have any good response to that. But it's a problem that I find very interesting and I'm actively thinking about.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you, Mark. Just a couple of comments there in the chat. So Francis, Carly, first of all, was talking about a few things to think about in terms of wider terms of digital engagement. And then Francis says you spoke about the divisions in society. I wonder how the privileged can understand about this at a wider level. What can we do as individuals? So that's a question from Francis, which you might be able to see as well, Mark.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think a starting point is to try and cultivate an awareness of our own experiences, and particularly the experiences of those around us, and to understand how what we experience as the norm or what we experience as taken for granted is a function of commonalities we share with, kind of people we're close to. So for example, the normalization of working from home, when for most of the population that hasn't been normal, and particularly something like video calling. So the Ofcom data that came out relatively recently shows that while there has been a huge increase in video conferencing and video calling over the last year, it's still not a majority pursuit amongst UK adults, or possibly, depending on how you classify adults, is something a small majority of adults now do. And so to understand how these features of our digital lives are not ones we share with others is very important. But I think beyond that, we need to have more of a political agenda around issues of digital inequality and digital exclusion. I'm working at the moment to try and cultivate a digital mentoring scheme between Cambridge University students with digitally excluded youth in the local area. And in the process, I'm working with a wonderful charity called CAM's Youth Panel, who've done really inspiring work during the pandemic to distribute laptops to people who didn't have connectivity and to support them in their use of these laptops. And these are kinds of initiatives that I think universities are incredibly well placed to assist with on a number of levels. And so I think to look for those kinds of initiatives and to see if there are ways you can volunteer as an individual, but also to speak to others within your institution and see if you can find ways of working together to try and address these kinds of exclusions, which are really pervasive because, even if your broadband, like mine, like so many of us, is a little bit unreliable, for many within the academy, there's not a sense that connectivity is a scarce resource for many in this country. And it's one which has enormous costs on their lives and well-being. There's data that's come out about the kind of opportunity costs, the trade-offs people make. So the number of people in the UK who are foregoing spending on other things because they need to sustain connectivity during this difficult time. And I think we need a better political language as well to talk about these issues and to think of connectivity as a right, not as something that is purely mediated through the market.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the question as well. We have just come past 16 minutes past, but I think we've maybe got time for one more question because I know other people need to get off to the rest of the sessions. But the final question, Mark, if that's okay, is from Charlie talking about sort of institutional space and digital platforms. The question is, do you find your work intersecting with disability theory, for example?
This is what I'm trying to work on at the moment because from my social media for academics work, I had a small section on accessibility, but I didn't think about it anywhere near as deeply as I wish that I had in retrospect. And I'm trying to understand these issues now, particularly at the level of how institutions cope with accessibility issues in the kinds of activities that they mandate. And how we develop workable guidelines that don't overload academics who may sometimes be struggling with the technology, but also how we make sure these are not things that people have to ask for, that the workable steps that can be taken to make digital platforms more accessible are things that are taken. And kind of how we square that at the level of departmental and institutional policy, I think is quite a complex question. But the landscape at the moment is really poor. And in part, I think that's because people like me who've been working on these issues didn't pay it enough attention. And so I'm trying to read a lot about it at the moment. And if there's anything you'd like to talk about or recommend I read, it'd be really good to hear from you if you want to email or talk to me on Twitter.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And thanks for the invitation for people to be in touch. There are lots of other comments and lots of really interesting thoughts on the chat there, but unfortunately, we don't really have time to go through them. But really just, Mark, to say thanks ever so much for this first keynote of the week. It's such a stimulating and thought-provoking series of ideas and practical tips that you've introduced us to. So on behalf of everyone here and obviously the SGSAH team as well, just to say thanks very much.